It was the spring of 1943, and the war had reached a dangerous crossroads. The Allies were preparing to strike at Nazi-controlled southern Europe, but they faced a deadly problem. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. The only question was where. The obvious target was Sicily, the gateway to Italy. Every strategist knew it, every general expected it, and even Hitler himself called Sicily the logical next step. That made it the most dangerous place to land. Inside a dimly lit London basement, a small group of intelligence officers gathered under the supervision of Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu and Flight Lieutenant Charles Comandelli. Their mission: to find a way to convince the Germans that the invasion would happen somewhere else. Not with bombs, not with spies, but with a lie so perfect it would change the course of the war. One officer leaned over the table and said quietly, "If the Germans expect us in Sicily, then we must make them expect us in Greece." The room fell silent. Then came the question that would define history. How? That's when the idea was born. What if they could plant fake invasion plans, top-secret documents, directly into German hands? And what if those documents appeared completely real? Not as if they'd been handed over, but as if they'd been lost. A plane crash, a dead courier, a briefcase full of secrets. Something so believable that German intelligence would never suspect it was a trap. All they needed was one thing: a body. A corpse that could pass for a Royal Navy officer, someone the Germans would believe had died carrying vital papers. Montagu looked around the table and whispered, almost to himself, "We need a man who never existed." That single sentence marked the beginning of Operation Mincemeat, one of the most extraordinary deceptions in human history. It would require creativity, ruthlessness, and the coldest form of imagination. They were about to turn a dead man into a weapon. Finding a body in wartime Britain was not as simple as it sounded. Every corpse was accounted for, every cause of death recorded, every next of kin notified. To turn one into a spy, even a dead one, required secrecy and precision. Ewan Montagu, a naval intelligence officer with the quiet manners of a lawyer and the imagination of a novelist, took charge of the search. He and his colleague, Flight Lieutenant Charles Comandelli of MI5, spent nights sifting through hospital and morgue records, looking for a man who could vanish from the world without raising questions. After weeks of searching, they found him. A homeless Welshman named Glyndwr Michael, who had died after accidentally consuming rat poison. He had no family, no known connections, and no one who would come looking for him. To history, he would be forgotten. To the Allies, he would become their most valuable secret weapon. The body was carefully preserved and transported in secrecy to a naval facility. There, the transformation began. Michael was given a new identity: Major William Martin, Royal Marines. He was to be everything Glyndwr Michael had never been: an educated officer, confident, respectable, and deeply trusted. His pockets were filled with the small, believable details of a life: theater tickets, a bill from his tailor, a photograph of a fiancée named Pam, love letters written by a female typist from MI5, filled with small imperfections that made them heartbreakingly real. Montagu and Comandelli built this man piece by piece, like artists sculpting a story. Every cigarette stub, every folded note was designed to convince the enemy that Major Martin had truly lived and died for his country. Then came the heart of the deception: a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, filled with classified documents. Among them, letters suggesting that the Allies would invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. It was subtle, not theatrical, just the kind of bureaucratic paperwork that spies would kill for. When the plan was ready, Montagu stood beside the coffin containing their phantom officer. He saluted. "Goodbye, Major Martin," he said softly. "You may be the most important man in this war." The operation was ready. All that remained was to deliver the body where the Germans would find it, without ever realizing that the entire thing was an illusion. The stage for deception was set, and the sea would be their messenger. In the early hours of April 19, 1943, a British submarine slipped quietly out of the Scottish port of Holy Loch. Its orders were sealed. Its mission was known only to the captain and two intelligence officers on board. Resting in a metal canister packed with dry ice lay the most unusual passenger in naval history, Major William Martin, Royal Marines, who, in truth, had never lived at all. The submarine, HMS Seraph, was commanded by Lieutenant Norman Jewell, a calm and meticulous officer trusted by naval intelligence. His orders were simple but chilling. Sail to the southern coast of Spain, near the town of Huelva, surface before dawn, and release the body so it would wash ashore naturally. It had to look like an air crash victim, drowned at sea. The plan depended on geography and politics. Spain was officially neutral but secretly sympathetic to the Germans. The British knew that Spanish officials routinely passed information to Nazi intelligence. If they found a body carrying secret Allied papers, the documents would reach Berlin within days. On the night of April 30th, as the submarine drifted near the Spanish coast, the crew prepared for their grim task. The metal canister was carried up onto the deck and opened. Jewell ordered his men to stand at attention. Inside lay the body of Glyndwr Michael, now Major Martin, dressed perfectly in naval uniform, life jacket secured, briefcase chained to his wrist. The captain read a short prayer, his voice barely audible over the waves. "We commit this body to the deep, in the service of the king." The sailors lifted the body and slid it gently into the dark waters. For a moment it floated pale against the moonlight, then slowly drifted away toward the shore. When the hatch closed and the submarine sank beneath the surface, the operation was officially complete. There was nothing more they could do but wait and hope the currents, the tides, and fate itself would play their part. 2 days later, on the morning of May 1st, a Spanish fisherman spotted something strange in the surf. A body dressed in the uniform of the Royal Marines, tangled in seaweed, a black briefcase still chained to its wrist. He called the authorities. By that afternoon, the local police had recovered the corpse, and within hours, German agents in Spain had already heard the news. Operation Mincemeat was in motion, and somewhere in Berlin, a web of lies was about to tighten around Hitler himself. When the body of Major William Martin was brought ashore in Huelva, Spain, local authorities did exactly what the British had hoped. They treated it with solemn respect and curiosity. Spanish officers noted his uniform, his identification, and the briefcase locked to his wrist. The man had clearly drowned at sea, perhaps the victim of a plane crash. They reported the discovery to British consular officials, and within hours, the WWII, Nazi Germany's military intelligence service, was listening. The Germans had informants everywhere in Spain, and the town of Huelva was one of their strongest footholds. Among them was Adolf Kloss, a German intelligence officer disguised as a businessman. He immediately relayed the details to his superiors. A drowned British officer carrying sensitive papers found on the coast. It was exactly the kind of accident every spy dreamed of. The Spanish conducted an official examination of the body. They were careful, respectful even, but they could not resist a look inside the briefcase. Inside were several sealed envelopes stamped top secret. Among them, a letter from Lieutenant General Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Alexander in North Africa discussing plans for a forthcoming invasion of Greece and Sardinia. Another letter, written in the easy tone of one friend to another, mentioning the supposed Sicily diversion. It was too perfect, and that was precisely the point. The documents appeared entirely authentic, full of routine military language, British humor, and a few bureaucratic mistakes. Every page was carefully designed to look unplanned. The Spanish photographed the papers before sealing them back in the briefcase, pretending nothing had been disturbed. But copies were already on their way to German hands. Within days, the documents reached the desk of Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the German Navy, and soon after, the Führer himself. Hitler examined them closely, his paranoia mixing with fascination. The letters confirmed what he already feared, that the Allies were planning to invade Greece, not Sicily. He immediately ordered reinforcements to the Balkans. Divisions were pulled from France and Italy, redeployed hundreds of miles away. Panzer units were shifted north. Sicily, the real target, was left dangerously exposed. Meanwhile, the British in London held their breath. They had no way of knowing whether the plan had worked or whether it had been discovered as a ruse. The body had been buried with full military honors in Hulva, his tombstone reading simply, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Born 1907, died 1943. Only 3 men in the world knew that Major Martin had never lived. Then, a signal arrived from British intercept stations. German radio traffic was full of references to the forthcoming operations in Greece. The bait had been taken, hook, line, and sinker. In early June of 1943, inside his headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler read through the latest intelligence reports brought from Madrid. The British documents recovered from the drowned officer, Major William Martin, were now fully translated and analyzed by his intelligence chiefs. The conclusion was clear. The Allies were preparing to invade Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily mentioned only as a decoy. Hitler's instincts flared. He had always believed the Allies would strike through the Balkans to reach the oil fields of Romania. Now these captured papers confirmed his suspicions. He called for a meeting with his generals and, in a fit of conviction, declared, "The enemy's main assault will come through Greece. Sicily is a diversion." That one decision would change the course of the war. Within days, orders went out across the Reich. Divisions stationed in France and Italy were redeployed to Greece and the Aegean Islands. Luftwaffe squadrons were shifted from Sicily to Crete. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was tasked with inspecting defenses in the Balkans, leaving the Mediterranean's true gateway nearly unguarded. From London to Algiers, Allied intelligence officers watched the intercepted signals pour in. Each one confirmed the deception's success. The Germans had moved thousands of troops and aircraft away from Sicily, all because of a man who never existed. Ewan Montagu and Charles Comandelli, the architects of Operation Mincemeat, could scarcely believe it. The plan they'd drawn up over late-night coffee and sleepless weeks had reached the desk of the Führer, and he believed every word. In North Africa, British and American troops were preparing for Operation Husky, the actual invasion of Sicily. Every detail was timed to perfection. When the first landing crafts set sail, Allied commanders knew they had one invisible ally working for them, the ghost of Major William Martin. On July 9, 1943, the skies above Sicily exploded with fire. Allied paratroopers dropped into the night, followed by hundreds of ships carrying soldiers and tanks. German defenses were thin, their air cover almost non-existent. In Berlin, when the first reports of the invasion reached Hitler, he refused to believe them. "This is the diversion," he said. "The real attack will come in Greece." Even as his forces in Sicily were collapsing, he held on to the lie his enemies had crafted. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. The Allies had taken Sicily, the first step toward the fall of Mussolini, the invasion of Italy, and, eventually, the destruction of the Third Reich. Operation Mincemeat had done what no weapon could. It had deceived Hitler himself. In the small Andalusian town of Hulva, the story of Major William Martin was whispered in cafes and along the docks for weeks after the body had been found. Locals spoke of the drowned Englishman with respect. Some even called him the hero who died for his country. Spanish officials, pressured by British diplomats, buried the body with full military honors in the local cemetery of Nuestra Señora de la Soledad. A small wooden cross marked the grave, adorned with flowers sent from his grieving fiancée, Pam. No one knew that Pam had never existed. Her photograph, tucked inside his wallet, belonged to a typist from Ifiv, a woman who had never met the man she supposedly loved. The British played their part perfectly. The embassy in Madrid sent formal letters demanding the return of vital classified documents, ensuring that the Spanish and their German contacts would be convinced of the paper's authenticity. Every polite protest, every official telegram was part of the script. The Germans were satisfied. The deception seemed complete, and when the papers were finally returned, with careful assurances that they had not been opened, the British intelligence officers smiled quietly. They already knew that the copies had long since made their way to Berlin. For Ewan Montagu, the operations architect, there was a strange melancholy to the success. He had built a man from nothing, given him a name, a rank, a fiancé, a life, and then used him to deceive the enemy. He often wondered about Glyndwr Michael, the real man beneath the uniform. A lonely drifter who had died unnoticed in a cold London basement, and who now rested as a hero in Spain, his grave visited by locals for decades. In one of his later notes, Montagu wrote, "In the end, he did more for his country dead than he ever could have alive." And indeed, in that quiet Spanish cemetery, beneath a false name and a borrowed rank, lay the man who had fooled an empire. His grave still stands there to this day, tended by the people of Huelva, who honor him as Major William Martin, Royal Marines. But beneath the marble stone lies a different truth, one that only a handful of men in history ever knew, that the greatest deception of the war had been built not on lies alone, but on the borrowed life of a forgotten soul. As the dust of the Sicilian campaign settled, the full scale of Operation Mincemeat's success became clear. In less than a month, the Allies had captured the island with far fewer casualties than expected. Mussolini's government collapsed soon after, and Italy, once Germany's proud ally, surrendered within weeks. But in the offices of British naval intelligence, there were no parades, no medals, only quiet satisfaction. Ewan Montagu and Charles Comendelli read the post-operation reports in silence. The evidence was undeniable. Hitler had fallen for their deception completely. The fake letters recovered from Major Martin's briefcase had reshaped the entire Mediterranean campaign. When Allied codebreakers intercepted messages from Berlin confirming that German troops were still being redirected toward Greece, even after Sicily had fallen, Montagu allowed himself a rare smile. "The body did its duty," he said, "more than most living men ever could." Operation Mincemeat had not only fooled Hitler, it had reshaped the future of intelligence warfare. The idea that information could be used as a weapon, that a dead man could mislead an empire, became a foundational lesson for the intelligence community. The operation's precision, creativity, and psychological depth stunned even the Americans, who would later model parts of their deception strategies on it. But within the victory, there was also discomfort. Only a handful of people knew that Major William Martin had been a homeless Welshman who had died in despair. To turn his body into a lie, even for the sake of victory, was a moral weight Montagu would carry for the rest of his life. Years later, he wrote in his memoir, "We gave him a life, a love, a purpose. In return, he gave us the greatest truth that even death can serve when the living must deceive." By the autumn of 1943, the Germans realized their mistake, but it was too late. The Allies had moved up the Italian peninsula, the tide of the war had turned, and Hitler's confidence in his intelligence agencies was shattered. He began distrusting reports, even from his own generals, a paranoia that would haunt him until his final days in the bunker. One false corpse had fractured the chain of trust that held the Nazi war machine together. And that, more than any battle or bomb, was the true power of Operation Mincemeat. When the war finally ended in 1945, the men who had orchestrated Operation Mincemeat returned quietly to their former lives. Ewan Montagu went back to practicing law, his official reports sealed under decades of classification. Charles Comendelli slipped back into obscurity within MI5, his contribution known only to a handful of officers who'd watched their deception change the world. But secrets never stay buried forever. In the years after the war, Stories began to circulate through intelligence circles about a dead man who fooled Hitler. Newspapers caught whispers, and rumors spread that the British had staged a massive deception using a corpse. Montagu was ordered to remain silent, but he knew history had a short memory. He wanted the truth recorded, not for glory, but to remind people that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with ideas. In 1953, he published a carefully censored book titled The Man Who Never Was. It revealed the broad outline of the operation but omitted key details, including the true identity of the body. The book became a sensation. Within a year, it was adapted into a film of the same name, turning Major William Martin into a household name across Britain. Audiences watched in awe as the story unfolded on screen: the corpse at sea, the fake letters, the deception that changed the war. Few realized that it was all true. Behind the fame, however, Montagu remained haunted by one thought: that the real man behind the uniform, Glyndwr Michael, had never been acknowledged. He had been transformed into a myth, his face forgotten, his name erased. The irony was cruel. The man who had never lived in the eyes of the world had also never truly died in the eyes of history. For Montagu, that burden lingered for the rest of his life. In private letters, he wrote that he sometimes dreamt of the man's grave in Spain, the simple stone that bore another's name. He wished he could visit it openly, lay a wreath, and tell the truth. But even in peacetime, some lies had to remain intact. The secrecy of Operation Mincemeat was its strength and its curse. For decades after the war, the grave in Hulva remained a quiet mystery. Tourists left flowers, sailors saluted, and locals told stories of the brave British officer who had died at sea carrying the secrets of an invasion. No one, not even most within the Royal Navy, knew that the entire tale had been a masterpiece of deception. Then, in the early 1970s, historians began digging deeper. Declassified records revealed fragments of the operation, internal memos, intelligence notes, and coded messages from naval intelligence. The files were dry, filled with bureaucracy, but in the margins were hints of a hidden truth. One British journalist, driven by curiosity, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Who was Major William Martin, really? The official birth records showed no such man existed. There was no Royal Marine by that name, no family, no trace. It was only in 1977 that the truth emerged. A British government memo, quietly released to the National Archives, finally confirmed what only a handful had known: that the body used in Operation Mincemeat had belonged to Glyndwr Michael, a Welsh laborer who had died in London in January 1943. The revelation stunned the public. The nameless drifter who had lived and died in poverty had, in death, deceived one of the most powerful men in history. His grave in Spain was updated to reflect the truth, and a new inscription was added. Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Visitors to Hulva began leaving 2 wreaths instead of one for Major Martin, the hero of deception, and one for Glyndwr Michael, the forgotten man who made it possible. Ewan Montagu lived long enough to see the revelation. When asked if he regretted using a real man for such a deception, he paused and said quietly, "We gave him a purpose. In the end, he helped end a war. I think he would have approved." The story of Operation Mincemeat was no longer just about tricking Hitler. It had become a story about sacrifice, anonymity, and the strange ways history remembers its heroes. A man who never knew glory in life found immortality in death. And every spy, every deceiver, every intelligence officer who came after would remember his lesson: that sometimes the smallest life can change the largest war. Operation Mincemeat did far more than deceive Hitler. It rewrote the rules of modern intelligence. Before 1943, deception in warfare had been mostly tactical: camouflage, fake troop movements, or double agents. But Mincemeat showed the world that a story could be the most powerful weapon of all. For the intelligence community, the operation became a blueprint. The art of blending truth with falsehood, crafting something so authentic it could not be doubted, became the foundation of psychological warfare throughout the Cold War. British MI6 and the newly formed CIA studied every detail of the mission: the forged letters, the use of personal details, the manipulation of emotion. It was the birth of what modern strategists now call strategic deception. Historians would later write that Major William Martin was not just a character in a secret operation. He was the prototype for the modern spy narrative, a man created entirely from imagination, whose very existence became intelligence. Every nation would follow this path. During the Cold War, misinformation campaigns, double agents, and planted evidence all owed something to the lesson of mincemeat, that people will believe what feels real, even if it's built on lies. The legacy extended far beyond espionage. It inspired books, films, and training manuals, but most importantly, it reminded every intelligence officer that war is fought as much in the mind as on the battlefield. Ewan Montagu died in 1985, having lived long enough to see his fictional officer remembered as one of the greatest deceptions in history. And in Huelva, Spain, the grave of Major William Martin, now shared with the name Glyndwr Michael, remains tended with flowers. Visitors still come to read the inscription, not realizing they're standing over one of the most successful secrets ever kept. Because in the end, Operation Mincemeat was not about fooling Hitler. It was about understanding belief itself, the fragile line between truth and illusion. A nameless man became a hero, a lie became history, and the quiet waves of the Spanish coast still whisper the secret of the man who never was.